What happens when the powerhouse women in entertainment clash over respect, legacy, and the truth about the music industry? That question was answered the moment Gladys Knight, the legendary Empress of Soul, sat down with Queen Latifah for what was supposed to be a celebratory interview, honoring her extraordinary career. Instead, viewers witnessed one of the most explosive talk show moments in recent memory, an interview so tense, so emotionally charged, that Gladys Knight did something she had never done in decades of television appearances. She walked off set mid-conversation. The confrontation peeled back deep wounds within the entertainment world and revealed just how fiercely artists will fight to protect their legacy. The atmosphere inside Queen Latifah's studio was electric from the start. Gladys Knight, impeccably dressed in a navy blue blazer and carrying her signature poise, settled into the plush interview chair across from Queen Latifah. The production team had spent weeks preparing for the moment, thrilled to host one of music's most revered icons for an intimate conversation. About her 6-decade career, Queen Latifah opened with her warm, welcoming smile. Gladys Knight, the Empress of Soul, she beamed. "Thank you so much for being here. Your voice was the soundtrack to so many moments in my household growing up." Gladys nodded graciously, hands folded elegantly. "Thank you, Dana. It's always a joy to speak with fellow artists who understand the journey." The interview began gently enough. They reminisced about Gladys's early days with the Pips, her transition to solo stardom, and the challenges of being a black woman in the music industry during the 60s and 70s. Gladys responded with her usual grace, weaving wisdom and experience into every answer. But the tone shifted when Queen Latifah leaned forward and said, "I hope you don't mind me being direct. There have been reports over the years about tensions with some newer artists, some who feel older legends look down on their contributions." A subtle change crossed Gladys's face, a tightening around the eyes. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," she replied calmly, "but I've always believed in lifting up other artists, especially young black women finding their voice." Latifah pressed gently but firmly. "There was that interview where you seemed to suggest today's R&B lacks the authenticity of your era. Some felt you were dismissing contemporary singers." The air grew noticeably colder. Gladys straightened, her melodic voice taking on a sharper edge. "I've never dismissed anyone's artistry. What I said was that the industry has changed, not always for the better. We had to prove ourselves night after night. We didn't have autotune or social media to launch our careers." But surely you're not saying today's artists don't work hard, Latifah countered. Gladys didn't flinch. "I'm saying that when everything can be fixed in post-production, when a career can be made from a 15-second clip instead of years of grinding in small venues, it changes the relationship between the artist and the craft. That isn't disrespect, it's observation." The studio audience felt the shift. Latifah, usually diplomatic, pushed again. "Don't you think that sounds a little elitist? Like you're gatekeeping what counts as real artistry?" Gladys let out a humorless laugh. "Elitist? Dana, I grew up in the projects of Atlanta. I've been performing since I was 8 years old. I earned every accolade through blood, sweat, and tears. If pointing out that the industry has lowered its standards makes me elitist, then I'll wear that label proudly." Latifah softened, attempting to cool the rising tension. "I didn't mean to offend you. I'm just trying to understand your perspective on how the industry has evolved." Gladys's eyes flashed. "Evolved? Is that what we're calling it? When young girls are told they must be half naked just to sell records?" Gladys Knight's voice hardened as she continued, explaining that lyrics had become so crude she couldn't play much of today's music around her grandchildren, and that talent shows often rewarded gimmicks over genuine ability. "That's not evolution," she declared. "That's devolution." The studio fell silent except for the soft hum of the cameras. Queen Latifah glanced toward her producers before turning back to Gladys. "I think you're painting with a pretty broad brush," she said carefully. "There are incredibly talented artists today who are pushing boundaries and creating meaningful music." Of course there are, Gladys conceded, though her tone suggested the exception rather than the norm. "But they're drowning in a sea of manufactured nonsense. And when someone like me points that out, we're called bitter or out of touch. I'm not out of touch, I'm experienced. There's a difference." Queen Latifah's voice grew more pointed as she countered. But isn't there something to be said for letting each generation find its own voice? I mean, I'm sure there were older artists who felt the same way about hip-hop when it was emerging. Gladys's eyes flashed with fire. When I was coming up, hip-hop was revolutionary because it gave voice to experiences nobody was listening to. It was raw, real, necessary. What's revolutionary about a computer doing half the work for you? The tension in the studio escalated, and Queen Latifah pressed forward, challenging her guest's perspective. With all due respect, Gladys, don't you think you're romanticizing the past a bit? The music industry has always had its problems. There were manufactured acts in your day too, that struck a nerve. Gladys's composure polished through decades of interviews began to crack. Manufactured acts, Dana? Are you seriously comparing the Supremes, the Temptations, Martha, and the Vandellas to what's being passed off as music today? Those artists could sing, they could perform, they had something to say. Queen Latifah fired back. And you don't think today's artists have something to say? What about Beyoncé, Alicia Keys, or someone like Lizzo, promoting body positivity and self-love? Don't you dare lecture me about Beyoncé, Gladys snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. That girl has more talent in her little finger than most of these so-called artists have in their entire bodies. But even Beyoncé gets caught up in a machine that demands she be more provocative, more controversial. It's heartbreaking to watch. Queen Latifah's expression hardened. So you're saying she's selling out? I'm saying the industry forces everyone to sell out to some degree. Gladys shot back, gripping the arms of her chair. And when veterans like me point that out, we get dismissed as jealous has-beens who can't accept that our time is over. Nobody called you a has-been, Gladys, Queen Latifah insisted. Didn't you? Gladys's voice was ice cold now. When you suggest I'm gatekeeping or imply I'm elitist for having standards, what exactly are you saying? That my opinion doesn't matter because I'm from a different era? Latifah shifted uncomfortably but tried to stay calm. That's not what I meant, and I think you know that. Do I? Gladys leaned forward, her eyes blazing. Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you invited me here not to celebrate my legacy, but to tear it down. To make me look like some bitter old woman who can't handle change. The audience was silent, transfixed by the raw emotion unfolding before them. Queen Latifah attempted to regain control of the moment. Gladys, I genuinely didn't intend for this conversation to go this way. I have nothing but respect for your contributions to music. Gladys laughed bitterly. Your respect? Dana, I was headlining concerts before you were born. I've won Grammys, been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, sold millions of records worldwide. I don't need your respect. I've earned it from generations who know what real artistry looks like. Queen Latifah's professional mask slipped, revealing frustration beneath. And there it is, the attitude younger artists complain about. This idea that because you came first, you're somehow more legitimate than those who came after. You want to talk about attitude? Gladys countered sharply. How about bringing someone on your show under false pretenses? How about ambushing a guest with gotcha questions meant to make them look bad? Queen Latifah shook her head. Nobody ambushed you, Gladys. These are legitimate questions about statements you made publicly. Statements that were twisted and taken out of context, Gladys shot back. Just like you're doing right now. Gladys Knight held her ground, insisting she had never said young artists didn't work hard, only that the industry had changed in ways that didn't always serve the music or the artists. But she said pointedly, nuance wasn't what Queen Latifah wanted. She wanted sound bites and drama. Queen Latifah bristled at the accusation, insisting she was trying to have an honest conversation about the state of the music industry. Honest? Gladys suddenly rose to her feet, her chair rolling backward as her frustration erupted. There's nothing honest about this ambush. You brought me here to make me the villain in your narrative about generational conflict. Well, congratulations. You got your moment. The camera crew scrambled to adjust their shots as Gladys began to remove her microphone. Queen Latifah looked genuinely alarmed and implored her to sit back down and discuss the issue calmly. But Gladys's voice thundered across the studio. as she accused the host of blindsiding her on national television and disrespecting a legend. For the sake of ratings, Queen Latifah finally stood up to her composure cracking as she snapped that perhaps the real issue was Gladys's inability to handle being challenged because she was too used to everyone kissing her ring. The words froze the room. Gladys, who had endured segregation, sexism, and decades of uphill battles with unwavering dignity, stared at Latifah with a look sharp enough to melt steel. "Kissing my ring?" she repeated slowly, incredulously, before reminding Latifah that she had been fighting for respect since before the host even knew what a studio looked like. She stressed that she had never demanded blind reverence from anyone. Queen Latifah fired back, asking why Gladys couldn't accept that the industry had evolved beyond what she represented, and wondered aloud why everything had to revolve around how much better things supposedly were in Gladys's era. Gladys replied firmly that in many ways, they were better when substance mattered more than spectacle, when someone needed to actually sing to be called a singer, when music was about connecting souls rather than chasing trends and sales. Latifah threw up her hands, calling it elitist gatekeeping wrapped in nostalgia. But Gladys stood by her standards proudly, declaring that if wanting excellence made her elitist, she wore the title gladly, just as she embraced being considered old-fashioned for believing music should elevate rather than degrade. The tension in the studio was electric as Latifah doubled down, accusing Gladys of living in a fantasy about the past and reminding her that earlier eras had their own scandals, exploitation, and deep discrimination. Gladys's eyes narrowed into blazing slits. "A fantasy? You think what I lived through was a fantasy?" she demanded, recounting the humiliations and injustices she survived while touring segregated America, signing exploitative contracts, and being told she was too dark and too soulful for mainstream success. "Don't you dare minimize what my generation endured." Latifah insisted she wasn't minimizing, but arguing that Gladys's views might be shaped by survivorship bias. She made it. Therefore, she believed the system worked. Gladys stared in disbelief. "You think I survived by accident, by luck?" she asked, reminding Latifah that every milestone she achieved came through talent, perseverance, and a refusal to compromise her artistic integrity, something she believed today's era of viral moments and manufactured personas often lacked. Latifah looked stunned and wounded when Gladys's comments seemed to imply that even her career might be viewed as part of that manufactured era. "Are you suggesting my career is manufactured?" she demanded. Gladys paused, studying her with decades of hard-earned industry instinct. She clarified that she believed Latifah's generation benefited from opportunities, that her own generation never had opportunities won through the battles Gladys and others fought. "The barriers we broke made your path possible," she said. "Yet here you sit using your platform to tear down the very people who paved the way for you." Latifah protested that she wasn't tearing anyone down but asking legitimate questions about Gladys's public statements regarding modern artists. Gladys Knight's voice rose into a commanding crescendo that filled the entire studio as she confronted Queen Latifah, telling her that she had been brought there under the guise of honoring her legacy, only to be painted as a bitter relic who couldn't appreciate modern talent. "That's not journalism, Dana," she said sharply. "That's character assassination disguised as conversation." Queen Latifah's professional composure finally cracked as she fired back. That maybe the problem wasn't her questions, but Gladys's inability to handle accountability after spending decades on a pedestal. The silence that followed was suffocating. Gladys stood perfectly still, her legendary poise unshaken even in the face of the attack. When she responded, her voice was quiet, but carried the weight of 60 years in the entertainment industry. She explained that she had been held accountable her entire life by critics, fans, and an industry that scrutinized her every breath, and she would not accept being disrespected by someone who invited her only to ambush her. Queen Latifah crossed her arms defensively, insisting she was trying to have a real conversation instead of the usual fluff. But Gladys countered that a real conversation required respect, listening, and sincerity, not cheap gotcha moments designed for ratings. Latifah then recklessly accused her of sounding like someone bitter that her time had passed, And those words, sharp as broken glass, finally pierced even Gladys's iron will. She repeated the phrase slowly, letting its sting hang in the air. Before delivering a devastating truth, legends do not have expiration dates, and icons do not fade because a new generation arrives. She refused to be treated as yesterday's news. Removing her microphone pack, she began walking off the set, prompting a panicked Queen Latifah to plead for her to stay and start over. Gladys turned back one last time, her silhouette framed by the studio lights, and told her that some things cannot be restarted, some words cannot be taken back, and some disrespect cannot be undone. She had never walked out of an interview in her entire career, but she had also never been so thoroughly disrespected by someone who should have known better. When Latifah asked desperately whether she would really walk out, over a disagreement about the industry, Gladys made her position crystal clear. She was walking out because she had been brought under false pretenses, ambushed for the sake of ratings, and shown blatant disregard for her legacy. And most of all, she was walking out because sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is refuse to participate in their own humiliation. With her head held high, the Empress of Soul left the set, leaving behind a stunned host and a breathless studio audience. As cameras captured Queen Latifah standing alone, visibly shaken by what had just transpired, the confrontation revealed deep truths about respect, legacy, artistic evolution, and the boundaries even legends must draw. It proved that even icons have limits, and sometimes the most dignified response to disrespect is to simply walk away. Asterisk.